Welcome, guys, back to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I'm thankful to have Jaime Blaustein with me. Jaime is the CEO and co founder at the Sylvia Brafman Mental Health Center, a world class behavioral health treatment center located in South Florida, focused on helping individuals and families thrive. Prior to this role, he was an investment banker at Credit Suisse in its global industrials coverage group in New York City. Jaime, thank you so much for joining us.
Arnab, really appreciate the opportunity and excited to see where this conversation goes.
Of course. Thank you. Thankful to have you on. So, for people that don't know you, can you kind of just set the scene of your childhood, where you grew up, your family situation, maybe what type of kid you were, things like that?
Sure. So I'm from New Jersey originally, a little town called North Caldwell. It's right outside, about 30 minutes outside of New York City. Really a quote unquote good kid growing up, no major issues. In fact, I was really good at like collecting these accolades that made it seem as though things were going really well, both internally and externally. And frankly, they were to some extent. But parents got divorced when I was 2, both got remarried when I was very young. So there was really no adjustment period that came with that. The way the world worked in my eyes was, you live with mom and you go visit dad every other weekend. But I was class president every year of high school. I was prom king. I really was a kid that was viewed as sort of a go-getter, a lot of friends, good grades. No major issues to speak of, and got into some good colleges, and that was, so I guess, sort of summarizes my youth and adolescence.
Yeah. You talked about it a little bit, but, just as you think back, growing up in a divorced situation, is there something you would tell an individual or a young kid today who's going through a similar situation on kind of managing family dynamics and not letting it affect your mental or your emotional state too much?
So from where I sit today, I can try to drum up my best advice, but I will say that my experience didn't necessarily lend itself to some big takeaway on that, only because there was no adjustment period. Again, I was 2, and therefore, again, it's probably easier at 2 than it is at 7 or 10 or 15. It's also really tough when you're a kid. I remember my dad would, in a very passive aggressive way, sort of allude to my not making enough of an effort to see him. And he made some comment one time, like, not exactly like this, but you'll I think his father had just passed, and he said something along the lines of, you'll appreciate me when I'm gone. And as a kid, like you sort of lack the foresight and the perspective to assign a true value to family, and you're just sort of caught up in your own world. So I guess my only advice would be just try to be a good son or daughter and do the best that you can. And frankly, I think more of the responsibility is probably on the parent, but I am also not a parent, so I don't know that I'm fully qualified to speak on that. I think I was doing the best that I could with the tools that I had at that time. And I think that concept of doing the best that I was capable of persisted over the next decade or so. It's just that what I was capable of really changed over time.
Yeah. Do you think it affected your personal relationships when it came to intimate relationships? Obviously, even though you were 2 when it happened, maybe some of your friends grew up in a 2-parent household where there wasn't a divorce, and, maybe that clouded some of your, feelings on Thanksgiving or holiday seasons because you had to
Yeah.
do 2 trips and people had, one place that they were at.
It's a great question. I've often thought about that. It's tough to really investigate that because you have no basis for comparison. You know, you only live once, as they say. So like at the time, could I have processed what that might have looked like if I did grow up in a, you know, with my mom and dad in the same household? No. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if there's like an undercurrent of feelings, or I wouldn't even call it trauma, but whatever, a mindset that I bring into my relationships today. I think my relationships all in all are quite good. But I do think sometimes that maybe it informed the way that I view romantic relationships. And I don't know that for sure. It's really just a theory. I will say that my step parents really, I struck gold in that department. You know, my mom, my stepmom, and my stepdad are incredible. I have really, really great relationships with them to this day. So it wasn't like I was, I was far from living in a broken home. But of course, no one can replace your birth parent. And I sometimes wonder, yeah, like would I be different today? It's a good question, but I'll never fully know the answer.
Yeah. You know, so obviously, you know, we were introduced based on, you know, some of the things that you've been through with regard to addiction. Um, you know, I have here that I think your first drink was at 14 and in eighth grade. Um, you know, I'm curious as you look back on that time period, um, you know, eh, do you hate that you started then, or like, how do you, you know, think about that? And, you know, as kids are growing up, would you have wanted to do it different? Would you have not done it and waited, or how do you kind of look at that early relationship with
Yeah.
alcohol?
I never once have thought I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have drank, or I should have drank later. Um, Frankly, I think given what I know about myself and my makeup and how I, you know, in time would prove to react to a substance when I put it in my body, I would think that waiting actually would have probably prolonged my, you know, 6 or 7 year nightmare into addiction. Most kids will at some point have a few drinks and try alcohol. I don't know many that haven't, and the majority of them, maybe they party a little too much at some point, maybe they get sick, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, they don't let it be the predominant force in their life. So there's no way that, you know, I was about to say there's no way that I could have foreseen that. My dad did pull me aside when I was younger, and he said, you know, you're predisposed to this thing being alcoholism addiction. But no one's going to take their parent. I mean, I guess some people will, but most people will not just sort of take their parents' word for it. They'll have to discover that on their own. So no, I view it as a natural progression up until the point where it was not normal anymore, which probably was around age 17 or so.
Okay. I'm, I guess I'm curious, do you want to talk about, you know, maybe that progression from, you know, 14 to 17, and as you look back, were there factors that you think maybe led to, you know, increased usage, or how do you view that time period, maybe in a high schooler that's
Yeah,
dabbling with alcohol a little bit right now,
sure.
kind of listening to this?
Yeah, you know, it was fun until it wasn't. And I was able to maintain, again, a pretty normal life internally and externally. Um, what factors contributed to my going that route versus, you know, earth people, as I like to call them, sort of not going that route?
Yeah.
I attribute it to a big genetic component. You know, I today I know there's this thing. within me. And I don't know if it's a gene or if it's a bundle of genes or if it's how my enzymes process alcohol or if it's, some sort of chemical imbalance. I've kind of given up trying to figure it out. I just know that it always affected me differently than it did other people. Were there environmental factors? Yeah, there must have been. I would say when it really took off around, again, 17, 18, it's an odd thing. It's sort of a catch-22, right? Because of that internal wiring, if you will, it creates external problems. And then the external problems create life circumstances that are difficult, and therefore you lean into the drinking and the using more so. And then they kind of feed each other, and that's why addiction is often, viewed as like a vicious cycle. But by the time I got to college, I was teetering on that line of being a full-blown addict. And so now you throw me into an environment that's very different, that has more temptation, that, I went to the University of Michigan, so a bigger school that was a lot different than, the small 250 person class that I was in high school. And all of those things combined created this perfect storm where it exacerbated my use. And I would say it worked in conjunction with the internal wiring, which is that when I start doing anything, and by the way, I see this bubble up sometimes with food to this day. I'm 9 years clean now. I see it bubble up with other behaviors, but when I start, I have a very hard time stopping. I typically have to get stopped. And later on, I would learn that there's this obsession component where if I was able to stop for some period of time, whether it be a couple days, a week, a couple weeks, I don't think I ever made it a couple weeks, but the mind would lead me back to it. And it would come in the form of some sort of lie that I would tell myself about, I can do one, I deserve it, no one will know. And I start again. And those are two features of alcoholism and addiction. It's the compulsion, number one, the inability to stop once I start. And two, the obsession once I have stopped, why I go back to it. So that internal wiring paired with changing external circumstances was sort of the perfect storm that catapulted me into, full-blown drug addiction.
I'm curious, at that time, would you say people outside of you were aware? Do you think friends or family were aware? And, obviously, if there's a parent watching, obviously you've mentioned how a lot of this may have simply been a physical addiction. Is there something, a friend or a family member can do? Maybe they're observing your behavior at a party or things like that. Is there something, I'm sure you've had this conversation with your parents, but does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think calling it out, people generally, if they're sort of in that phase that I described, don't respond well to you have a problem or you need to stop, largely because it carried such importance in my life. The ability, to drink and use was very important to me, as it is for most addicts. But along the way, family, friends started chiming in more and more about what they observed. And I would say from the parents' perspective or the loved one's perspective, keeping it on them, like, this is what I see. I see that you start, you can't stop, you become out of control. I think that's frankly the best that you can do. And over time, once somebody, if they are truly an addict or alcoholic, once the pain gets great enough, the accumulation of those observations or chime-ins or whatever might finally catch up to that person to where they see their truth maybe a little bit sooner than they would have otherwise. But it's a very challenging thing from the perspective of a parent because you can't fix that person. And it's a really discouraging thing for people to hear because they want to know that, like many other problems in their life, they can do X, Y, Z or take this course of action and get this result. And it's such a cunning, baffling thing, alcoholism and addiction, that's simply not enough. Now, on top of that, once it's very clear there's a problem, not enabling is a really important skill and frankly, a very challenging thing to know how to do, because there's this confluence of all these like very different emotions. You're scared for the person, you love the person, you're angry at the person, you're sad for the person. So there's all these different things that are pulling you in different directions. And the intuitive thought would be, okay, I need to help them, like with compassion. And that's true to some extent, but the line of compassion versus enabling is it's a very thin one. So people fall into this trap where they sort of enable and they cushion the blow, or they cushion the fall, I should say, and it actually prolongs their journey through addiction. At the same time, it's very tough to say, you can't come home. You have no place to stay. Good luck on the streets. So, Al-Anon, there's a whole program for that. Al-Anon is, for family members of folks that struggle with addiction, alcoholism. There's a whole program for a reason, because it's a very tough thing to navigate, and you need some support, and you'll do these things that involve not enabling, and it'll feel like you're being a bad parent or a bad wife or husband, whatever, but in actuality it's what the person needs. So it's a really challenging situation that folks are in, but I would say the general theme would be being honest, not enabling, and showing tough love.
Internally for yourself during this time period, do you think you felt like you knew you had a problem? Because it's interesting thinking about your class president, 8th to 12th grade, prom king, going to Michigan, like you're still being successful, in terms of where, people are evaluating quote unquote success. So you may not, I don't know what your mind, like you may not even have thought it was a problem for you.
Yeah. The answer is, that's right. I did not think it was a problem. And that illustrates the insanity, because my life started completely crumbling, but my mind can't see that. And that's the subtle, that's the real insane twist of addiction, alcoholism. It's a disease that centers in the mind. Call it, whatever you want, disease, condition, problem. It's a problem that tells you that you don't have a problem. And so while all of these instances and all this evidence of external and internal unmanageability started piling up, call it between 17 and 21, such as arrests, overdoses, multiple rehabs, friends completely falling by the wayside, sort of being a lone wolf. My mind tells me, no, this is not the problem. This is the solution. And, I've said this before. I don't know if I've said it on podcasts, but like the first rehab, I went to 7 in total. The first one was, this is not a disease and you guys are crazy. When I did my intake, I just like to party. Second rehab was, okay, maybe it's a disease, but I don't have it. Third rehab was, okay, it's a disease, but like I only have it a little, and like I don't buy this solution that you're telling me. The mind knew there was a problem way before the soul knew there was a problem. And that's the key shift. It's from here to here, and that's a long distance for a lot of people. I mean, For me, it was probably a 3 or 4 year distance, right? Or maybe at 21, 22, I could say, yeah, I have a problem. I didn't really feel it until 24. And for some people, that's a 20-year journey. For some people, that it never happens.
Yeah.
So you really have to feel it. When you're told enough times, hey, you've got a problem, you got to go to rehab, this and that, maybe the mind will latch on to intellectually believing that. But deep down, I felt like, no, it's more of a solution. I'll think my way out of this and I can beat this on my own willpower. And those thoughts are all laced with delusion, but you really believe it.
You talked in previous podcasts and things like that about, different substances, whether it's weed, Adderall, heroin. I'm curious, for you, um, do you feel like alcohol is a gateway drug or, and if not, like, again, like, why wasn't there a hesitation? Can you talk about that mindset of like, you're trying different things? Um, why do you think there wasn't a hesitation in exploring these other drugs?
Yeah. So the first part of your question, I don't know if my answer is, and keep in mind, I'm not clinical, I'm not medical. This is just my own experience. My view on that is, gateway to me implies causation as opposed to correlation. I think it's more correlation, meaning if you're gonna try anything at any point in time, you'll typically start with alcohol because it's the most socially acceptable. Not, hey, because I did alcohol, I'm now going to do these other things. So sure, you could make the argument that if I never tried alcohol, maybe I'm not going to try anything else. But I think that's more correlated, right? That's correlated with a mindset that says I'm not going to do any substance. And by virtue of deciding and actually following through on not drinking, I'm probably going to take that same mindset and apply it to other substances too. In terms of the progression, I think there's the progression of the true chronic addict alcoholic, and then there's the progression of, and like I said before, the earth people, where for me, I really like drinking. I like smoking weed. I would say most kids drink and smoke weed at some point. But really, it's the role that it played in my life. And it's the fact that I could never get enough. And the not being able to get enough made me open-minded to, I want to try other things to have, to take me out of me and to facilitate these experiences that, alcohol and weed did for me in the very beginning. So I was always very excited, more so than normal people, about the prospect of trying something else and harder things. I would say a lot of my friends that are not addicts got to college, maybe tried some coke, do it on the weekend, but then, come time for the week, get back to business, dabble in things here or there. But it never was a progression that was like hard and fast like mine was, where I was like really searching, sort of a take it or leave it approach. So for me, the way that I was wired got me wanting to do more and more and more. Nothing was ever enough. And that, took me through many rehabs where the substance of choice was different in almost every one. It was a lot of drinking and weed, and then it was a lot of pills, a lot of uppers, then there was a lot of downers, then it was a lot of opioids, and then it was heroin, so that's ultimately where it landed me. I don't know many people that just say, hey, I'm going to use heroin casually after only drinking, right? Like you kind of get there over time because you become more and more desperate to get that hit that you're looking for.
I'm curious, you talk about 7 rehabs. Is there the person you were in that seventh and final rehab, um, I guess, is there some way, like, what changed, or like, is there some way to kind of um, expedite that process for other people, or
Yeah,
um,
it's a good question. So that's the $1 million question.
yeah.
Because if that answer, or if that question was solved, a lot of people would be clean right now that aren't, and that probably need to be. The progression for me had, and everyone else that I know that's clean and sober, it had to be an internal one. So in my case, it was, all those 6 rehabs before the 7th. Sure, I was not clean, and there was a lot of wreckage, but they were all necessary to get me to the point where I finally waved the white flag. And for me, I was in a lot of pain towards the end, and based on what I had heard in rehab, I was at least willing to go to 12-step meetings and to get connected with people that were doing recovery in a way that seemed appealing to me. And so I was going to these meetings and I couldn't stop using. And so both of these things, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on, because I could see the addiction playing itself out while I sort of had one foot in the recovery process. And so for me, it was a combination of intellectually learning these things about what addiction is and about what recovery is, and also seeing it play out where, oh my God, I truly cannot think my way out of this. I truly cannot stop. I'm going to die. And I believe that there is a path forward if I try this new way of life. And you throw in some pain, you throw in some circumstances, and you have the recipe for surrender. So for me, it was, I just remember I could not stop at the end. I was lying to everybody. There was a few day period at the end where it just went from my head to my heart, and I just knew, okay, I need to pick up the phone and go somewhere and be inside 4 walls for a bit, because I cannot stop, and I better hit the ground running and do some work. And for me, it was in a 12-step program, or I'm going to go back to it like I always did.
I'm interested, during this process of the rehabs, when sort of internally you've acknowledged the problem, was there ever a point where you lost hope? You've gone through 5 arrests, you've gone through some overdoses, you've gone through 6 other rehabs. Was there,
Oh yeah, 100%. I remember I got arrested shooting dope in a bathroom stall in New York City, in Penn Station. And I remember I hadn't yet told my parents exactly what happened, like that I got arrested, but I kind of like sugarcoated it and said, oh, I relapsed. Like I was never really clean. But I just remember the words coming out, I'm hopeless. And I carried that feeling for a while, because no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much willpower, no matter how much self-knowledge I had, without fail, I would go back to it. And in an odd way, that is the right mindset. I am hopeless on my own power. And that makes me open to, okay, I need to find something then. I need to find some power, whether it's other people who are doing the same thing in a 12-step program, whether it's God, whether it's whatever it might be. I need to find something, because I have limited resources to beat this thing on my own. There was a prevailing mentality that I know I need to stop, but I know that I won't. And that's a very lonely place to be, being in that limbo, right? Like knowing in my mind I need to stop, knowing in here that I'm not going to, because I'm not ready. But I wouldn't have been able to admit that to myself, right? So the mind and the heart are playing tug of war. And I would say that that's a hopeless place to be.
Yeah, I guess, do you want to talk about, that early part of maybe that first year that you became sober? Um, you know, what strategies worked for you? Were you ever close to relapsing, within the first couple months or so, or whenever? Um,
Yeah. So I got out of rehab. I went down to Florida. Immediately after I moved back to New Jersey, I lived in an Oxford house, which is basically a halfway house. I got real humble, and I really just jumped into the 12-step process like my life depended on it, because I knew that it did. And that first year, I look back on it pretty fondly, actually. The detox, of course, from heroin and crack and Xanax was painful, to say the least. But once the body came around, and once I started to see that, okay, I'm having a shift in perspective, call it a spiritual awakening, a psychic shift. Different people have different, terminology for it. Like that hit of hope, like, oh my God, my life is not over. I think there might be something going on here to what I'm doing with my life today. And I'm seeing my thinking change. And therefore, I'm seeing my external circumstances change tremendously. That's a wave. Some people call it a pink cloud. Of course, there were some hard times. I was still learning how to deal with life. I was not used to experiencing emotional volatility, really. I mean, I was, but I wasn't, like it was always sort of artificial, and I would medicate myself.
yeah.
So I do recall there was one time where I not thought about it, where I guess I thought about it, but I was close to taking an action to pick up. And I remember I was in the Oxford house. I knew that my job, which I was at Wells Fargo. I don't know how I held the job down, but because of all the wreckage when I was using, and then I went to treatment, I knew I didn't have much time left there. And so I was looking for jobs on like the common area computer at this halfway house. And I was like starting to apply to jobs, and the computer crashed. And that really got me spinning. Now, that's a small thing on one hand. On the other hand, it illustrates it wasn't really about the computer crashing. It was about, I had a lot of fear about my career, about this idea of, am I going to be successful or am I not, about financial insecurity, about what people thought of me. So that's what that represented. The lack of control that I had over making it happen, over how the world and my life is going to unfold. And on the heels of that realization and doing a lot of work on myself, and the 12 steps and writing and seeing, okay, that is the common theme here. I'm run by fear. As a result of being in fear, I get into a lot of delusion about my life. I start seeing things in a way that's not true to reality. I start to try to manipulate and get you to play the role that I think you need to play in my life for me to be okay. And I go out, and in doing that, I step on people's toes, and then they retaliate, and it feels like they're creating a harm towards me out of the blue, and then I cop a resentment. I saw this cycle of how it was all working, and it was all driven in fear.
Yeah.
So that, to me, again, it wasn't about the computer crashing. It was about, okay, I need to find something that will take me out of this fear that I'm so used to living in. And so beyond that, no, the extent to which, thoughts crossed my mind were simply that would be nice, right? If I see someone drinking a beer on a summer day, that would be nice, but very quickly followed by, yeah, but I know I can't do that. if I go have a beer right now, and I still believe this to this day, if I have a beer right now, maybe I can get by the rest of the night on that one beer. But give it another couple days, give it a week, give it 2 weeks, I will be a total disaster. I will be kicked out of my apartment building. I will be probably in jail. I'll probably be dead, honestly. I'll be shooting heroin within a couple days. And I say this with 9 years clean, knowing full well that I don't want that to happen, and knowing what I know today. And that's because I respect this thing so much, this thing being the disease. I know it's a disease of the mind, and I respect it enough to know that. So the name of the game then becomes, how do I get as comfortable as I can in my own skin and be happy with sitting with me to the point where I don't want to get out of feeling how I'm feeling. And therefore, I'm not going to fall victim to the delusion that I can do one, or that I deserve it, or that nobody will know. And that's what recovery is for me.
Yeah. I'm curious, obviously, during the time period that you weren't sober, maybe you hurt people, and, affected certain people around you negatively. As you became sober, was that tough to forgive yourself on, maybe someone thinking you're an a-hole, or someone being mad at you for something, or that process? Any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the 12-step process took care of all of that. And that's the great thing about this, is like, on the heels of that surrender, I don't need to think my way out of it anymore. I just need to take action. So by virtue of taking action and going through this process, not to get too in the weeds on the steps, but by virtue of the 4th step, I got free of everything that I had done. And when I got to the 9th step, which is the amends process, I had the opportunity to sit across from all of those people, and make a formal amends and free them, which in turn freed me. So my advice is, if you're a true addict alcoholic, is go through that same process. If not, sure, I can go apologize to people, but if I don't do it in a way that has depth and weight, if I don't truly see the nature of the harm that I created, if I don't take time to examine why I did what I did, what selfish motives and self-seeking motives were driving me, and put myself in the position of that person, almost like in a meditative way, looking at me from their perspective as I created the harm, then you can almost do more harm than good by going in and trying to make an amends. But when you are fully clear on the nature of the harm, and they can feel that you can feel that, that's when they get free. And that's when sometimes the relationship is actually advanced beyond where it would have been had the harm never been created. So I didn't come up with any of this stuff on my own. I just followed directions. And, the result of that is all of the relationships that are supposed to be in my life today are, and a lot more.
From a mental health perspective, especially given sort of how successful you've been since you've been sober, do you have like flashbacks to your old self? Like, you have these 2 identities where you like really, from a mental health standpoint, didn't have it together, and now you do have it. And sometimes it's hard to like remember what that old self was like, and like,
Yeah.
kind of,
Yeah. I was just saying to somebody, I wish I could actually capture that more easily. Like, sometimes little things happen and it's a quick flashback, right? Like, I forgot where it was recently, but I think they used some sort of cleaning product in a bathroom. And I remember I was going to this bathroom a lot. And I don't know if I was using in the bathroom, but it brought me, smells tend to do that. They sort of bring you back very, to a distinct point in time. I wish I could capture that a little bit more clearly, because the blessing and the curse of all this is like my life was completely transformed to a point where it's not even recognizable compared to what it once looked like. And it's easy to forget that, you know, this is all grace and I'm playing with house money, you know, because I was just saying to somebody, you know, we get all this stuff and then it just becomes the status quo and what you expect. And you forget, no, the true measuring stick of what was it like, you know, 9 years ago. But I'm going to compare it to last week. And I have to, you know, remember that to truly be grateful. And it's important to remember that to some extent. And you know, my mom sometimes will forward me emails. I mean, I have a whole folder that has, you know, legal paperwork and old writings and things like that I like to look at. So it's a good thing. It can be kind of painful, but I wish I could actually recapture those feelings like in a very temporary way a little bit more easily.
Yeah. I'm curious, you know, obviously I don't know, but like I would think years 0 to 1 may have been the hardest. Now after that, like you're now 1 to 8 plus years. Um, you know, talk about that journey. You know, obviously people talk about that first part, but you know, 1 through 8, how has that been for you? Have there been strategies there once you've kind of, you know, done your 12 step, you've kind of, now you've got your friends, you've got things like, how has that kind of process been?
Yeah. You know, I'm going to push back a little bit on your assumption, which is that 0 to 1 was harder. It's not a downhill journey necessarily. Okay, so in some ways, yes, it was harder. The not using, I guess, honestly, the obsession for me was lifted like pretty quickly. And that's like the insanity. Like for a long time, I could not use no matter what. I will use no matter what. And then I got to a point where I had this big surrender and I just knew it was over and I started taking the action. So that first year, as difficult as it was to like learn how to live life at times, it was also a real steep, you know, curve upwards, right? Like we get things back way faster than we probably deserve when we start doing the right thing. And that curve starts to flatten out a little bit for me. You know, I continue to grow spiritually. I continue to grow mentally in my career, etc. But then, you know, that first year too, everyone's giving you a pats on the back and like, oh my God, you're amazing, blah, blah. You know, I don't really get that much anymore. Not that I need it,
Yeah.
But now it's just like, yeah, okay, Jamie's sober. And your life expands to an amazing degree, but now you have more to lose. So it's almost like that first year, it's like, geez, I'm so aware that I'm playing with house money. I was a dead man 6 months ago. And like, look at me now. I'm like getting this new job and I'm like moving into this new apartment and I have like hope. And then, you know, 1 through 8, like it's all been great. I mean, I've been very vigilant about doing the things that I need to do to maintain my mental health and to continue to grow. And so it has still been a very, very much an upward trajectory. You know, I moved out of that Oxford house. I lived in Hoboken, New Jersey. I got a new job in finance. All these friends started coming back into my life. I went to Duke, got my MBA, traveled the world, went to New York City, did investment banking. You know, now I'm CEO of a company. So like things have steadily gotten better and better and better. But with that comes, you know, sometimes I said to someone like, in an odd way, that first year was hard, but it was so simple. You know, it's a little bit less simple now. But I'm not complaining. I mean, this is just living life. Right? This is all good stuff. So it's important to maintain that perspective where, thank God, you know, I have problems in areas of my life that I used to not have areas in. You know, so thank God that I have a problem with, you know, one of my 30 employees. And thank God that, you know, my microwave might not be working in my Miami condo on the water, and all of those things feel like problems, but life can get a little more stressful. Whatever I forget the term. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. I'm not wearing a crown, and I try to maintain the disposition of servant, and like, I didn't do any of this. I was given this. But you understand what I'm saying, the concept of, okay, things get really good. That's almost at times when things can get a little bit more difficult. But I have a process. I'm firmly grounded in doing the right thing in recovery, and I have a great network. And, this just becomes how we live life now. Like all that 12-step work, sponsoring guys, it's just embedded in life. Like I'll go to a 12-step meeting, and then I'll go to a work meeting, and then I'll take a phone call, and then I'll talk to my family, right? It all just kind of flows. But the priority always has to be doing what I need to grow spiritually and in recovery. And if I take care of that, all the other stuff will take care of itself.
Yeah. I'm curious, was there a time period where, when you're meeting new friends, let's say when you started at Duke, and, you're meeting new people at a party or stuff like that, was it easy for you to just be like, when they're like, let's grab a drink, was it easy for you to say, oh, I'm sober, like I used to be an addict, I'm so, like, how did you approach that situation, where everyone around you is kind of doing it, but then obviously that you can't, and you want to fit in, you want to vibe with people. Can you talk about those situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love talking about this, actually. So like early on, call it first 6 months of sobriety. Again, I was living in Hoboken. I would go on dates in the city, and I would get there early, and I would have them fill up a cocktail glass with a club soda, because I was really scared about telling them that I don't drink. All of the thoughts running through my mind, they're gonna think I'm a screw up, and I also really wanted the social lubricant, but I knew that I couldn't. And then over time, I started to feel more comfortable in my own skin by virtue of doing all the things that I've already talked about. And I started to like own it and sort of like try to rock it in a way. And then also around that time, probably 26 years old, people start to kind of get out of that party kind of college-y mentality of like, yeah, we, party, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, right? People start to, like, at least in New York, and I'm sure in Boston, shift to like a more grown-up mentality. And so all, those things all were kind of tailwinds that worked in my favor. And by the time I got to Duke, I remember, because like you get there and the culture revolves around drinking, not at Duke necessarily, but in all MBA programs. And I remember, you get there and there's all, like every single night there's drinks, right? Like, because that's what you do. And I just sort of owned it. And I actually, looking back on it, people were so cool about it. And I found that people actually had, and they still do to this day, a lot of respect for that. And so in the first month or so, the class president or whatever basically tapped me to be the social chair of the class, meaning I was the one planning the stuff at the bars and, the stuff that involved drinking. And that's really cool. I tell people that are trying to get sober, because like you think your social life is over, and that's not a big thing in and of itself. But when I can tell someone like, hey, they thought that I would be the best person to facilitate these social events, and I was literally the one person that was not drinking. That's pretty cool. That is a good illustration of the fact that, no, I can be part of life. I can go out. I can do things that normal people do. And I try not to like wear it with like, as a badge of pride, but sometimes I do, honestly. Like I'm proud of it. when you own it and you rock it, and I know it doesn't really matter too, because there are times where I get maybe a negative reception or they won't say it, but I think that they do. Oftentimes they may have an issue of their own, but you know what? I know my truth, to thine own self be true. I know my truth. So that's enough for me.
That's amazing. I'm curious about your view on how society views addicts. Here and now, um, when there's like a famous sports person, like let's say Delonte West or whatever, and we're talking amongst my friends or whatever, and one of us is saying, "Oh, well, I have no empathy for that person or so and so because they created their life the way they are." Is I'm curious, like, is there for someone that has that mindset of lack of empathy for people with addiction, um, is there something you would tell them in terms of, you know, trying to bridge that gap of creating more understanding and more empathy for
Yeah.
people that have addiction?
Yeah. It's another really good question. It's tough because if you take most addicts and you apply the criteria that you normally use to judge people, right? Whether they're a good person or a bad person, an ethical person or not, they're going to, in most cases, be judged as a liar, a cheater, someone that has no respect. So, by normal human being standards, they're probably not a person that you want to be around. I get why it's difficult to apply a different set of standards to somebody else, because if you're, as a non-addict or alcoholic, if you're applying like your own experience with alcohol and drugs, you would say, yeah, I get that you like to do it. I get that it makes you feel good, but I like that too. And I stop because I don't want to be on the streets or whatever, stealing from people and lying and this and that. Like, apply the same discipline that I'm applying to this issue. And that does illustrate a lack of understanding. Addicts and alcoholics, I know it's tough because it's not something that can be applied with logic or approached with logic, right? Logic would say, just stop doing it. Like, why would you keep doing it if it's resulting in all of this craziness? But it's not a logical condition or disease. And so I would say view these people as sick people, not bad people. And maybe be open-minded to the fact that I don't know what I don't know. And it doesn't make sense to me, but I have to think that someone like Delonte West or myself or someone else, they don't want to be that way. And that is like the true marker of an addict, is they lack the power of choice. And their mind is convincing them of tricks. And you'll see that if they were to get clean and truly have a shift in how they think and view life, you'll see a completely different person. And that delta will kind of illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. I get that it's tough from an earth person perspective. But I've been in it, so I know from personal experience, there's something different about these people. And I would say if a normal person was like stealing from you and lying and cheating, like it's sort of a different set of circumstances. So try to use a little bit of lack of prejudice that maybe I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah. So, Jamie, now, you're CEO and co-founder of Sylvia, the Sylvia Brafman. Do you want to talk about what you guys are doing there? Who can use your services? How you guys differentiate yourself among companies in this space?
Sure. So, I like I said, I was on Wall Street. I was an investment banker in New York, and January 2021, I got a call from this guy that I knew from 11 years earlier named Ben Brafman. And he owned a larger rehab in Florida that I went to when I was 21 years old. He kicked me out of rehab, actually. But we kind of maintained touch over the years. And he randomly thought, okay, this guy is clean. When I would visit Florida, I would offer to come speak to the patients. And maybe he has an appetite for starting something with me, knowing that I had, again, my personal experience, but also a business background, and knowing that he did not have a business background, but he was extremely brilliant clinically. And so he asked me about this, and I thought about it from a personal and a professional standpoint, and I saw that this checked a lot of boxes. I could help a lot of people and also do a lot of things professionally that I really wanted to. So we got together and opened up the Sylvia Brafman Mental Health Center a year ago. We are primary mental health as opposed to primary substance abuse. So there are a lot of folks that come to us with addictions, and we are as equipped as anybody to treat that. But we made a deliberate decision to go anxiety, depression, bipolar, your typical primary mental health diagnoses, because we knew that there was a big gap in the really, quality care facilities out there, while there were a ton of, conventional sort of drug rehabs. And so, we opened this inpatient and outpatient facility just west of Fort Lauderdale. And we're doing a lot of great work for patients and their families. Like, we have an extremely strong clinical and medical backbone, some of the best talent, frankly, in the country, as clinicians, as doctors, as psychiatrists. We have a really, really strong family program that Ben himself runs, which, 11 years ago, I was sitting in that family night, we call it. Yeah. Really try to approach mental illness a number of different angles, kind of throw the kitchen sink at them and see what sticks, and then hone in on those avenues that are super effective: clinical, medical, psychiatric, spiritual. We just brought on this guy, Peter Marinelli, who's a massive sort of international speaker who's doing a lot of great works, especially with the addicts and alcoholics. Different things like TMS, that's transcranial magnetic stimulation treatment, genetic testing, different things, because it's so complex and individuals are so different that we want to kind of be a one-stop shop for everything and be heavily involved with the families. We say the family participation is a non-negotiable with us. We want them to be involved. And yeah, it's been amazing. Obviously, drinking from the fire hose the first year as somebody that's new to behavioral health, but we're rock solid, and we're doing great work for folks.
Awesome. Well, Jamie, we talked about quite a bit, in this time that we've had. Is there something, obviously we come with the framework of maybe someone who's maybe currently suffering from addiction, maybe watching this. Is there anything else that you would want to leave us with as we look to close?
I would just say that there is a lot of help out there, and a broken mind can't fix a broken mind. And so my natural disposition is to think my way into feeling better, or think my way into right action. And my journey confirms that it's actually the opposite. It's acting my way into right thinking. And sometimes that acting is, okay, I need to go get help. And when I act my way into right thinking, the mind typically follows. I start taking actions, my mind follows. I want to get out of my mind. The mind is not going to help me in a very odd way. It will intellectually, but if I can get the mind right by taking the right actions, then I can apply my mind and my intellect in a really constructive way. Whereas if I don't, it's going to be used against me. So there's a lot of hope for people that struggle with addiction and mental illness. I'm one example, but I've seen people over and over completely reborn, and I've seen greater miracles than myself. So the help's out there, and nobody is beyond repair.
Awesome. Jaime, if people want to support you or the Sylvia Brafman Mental Health Center, what's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah, people can follow us on Instagram. It's at Sylvia Brafman Center. They can check out our website, sylviabrafman.com. And of course, I'm always open to connecting with anybody. My email is Jaime, Jaime, .Blaustein, Blaustein, at sylviabrafman.com.
Perfect. Well, Jaime, I just want to acknowledge you, man. It was really cool to kind of be able to dive deep and talk about your journey. And I thank you for being so open and honest. And it's a really good example, and hopefully provides inspiration for people struggling, using your life as an example. And I hope you recognize your strength in being that person that's gotten themselves to a good point and now helping others. And that's an amazing thing. Improving lives is always a great thing to leave as a legacy. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arnav, and great work you're doing as well. And hopefully someone gets helped by this podcast, and we'll keep it going.